Before I scrap this copper, I'm going to take the time to separate the brass and all of the fittings from the copper so that I can change the grade and increase my return on this particular scrap pile. So what we have is we've got old plumbing pipes, we've got copper pipes, and then if you take a look at any of the fittings where there's solder, any of these valves, the valves are actually brass. So your whole mixed grouping of this scrap is going to be downgraded to the lowest grade when you have mixed items in there. In this particular instance, it's a considerable difference. So I'm going to increase my return on this pile by taking off the copper, and what I mean by that is I'm going to cut away just the straight copper and see if I can at least get it to number 1, possibly number 2, but it's definitely not going to be downgraded to that lowest grade. So I'm going to take just a few minutes of time and clean this up, and we'll see what happens. Hang with me. If you like my video, please tap that like button. Also, I invite you to subscribe so you can follow along so you don't miss any important parts of scrapping and increasing your return value. In this particular project, I'm using scrap to make money for my van build. Please subscribe and tap that like button. This is an 8-foot piece of copper pipe, and because it has this fitting on the end, it's going to be downgraded considerably. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a few minutes to cut that off, and that will instantly increase my return on this whole piece of copper pipe. It just takes a few moments. I don't have the right blade on here. I should have a metal cutting blade, but I don't. At the time, I'm just going to take 10-15 minutes to reduce this down and increase the grade of it. On this particular piece, there are a lot of joints. I'm not going to take the time to cut out these little pieces of copper. I'm going to go for the bigger win. So I'm going to cut it right here, just past all of the solder, so that all will be downgraded, but the rest of this piping will be definitely at the higher grade. These fittings are typically brass fittings, so you'll want to separate those. I'm going to cut that piece off. I'm also going to check the top and make sure that that's not steel. Typically all of your water valves are steel, so when I get ready to cut this one, I'm going to take off that steel piece, and then this copper pipe, it's painted, but still might be able to squeeze it in. So I'm going to cut this here. This will be my brass, and I'm going to take off that steel so I can see if I can get a little bit better grade. Here's another example. Same thing with any shower or tub valves. Those are all brass in there, so you're going to want to separate all of that from that copper piping. Tap the like button to like my videos, and I also invite you to subscribe to my channel by clicking that subscribe button. This big piece of brass, I'm going to leave all these little extra pieces on here, and that's just going to go as my brass fitting, but I'm changing the whole grade of all of the extra copper piping that's in with this. I'm using old blades that I found in my shed. They're all pretty rusted and beat up, and this old little saw is doing its job. Instead of scrapping it, it still has a little life left into it, so I'm using it. You can use a grinder, you could use a sawzall, anything you want. I'm just happen to use this tool before it's on its last legs. I'll use it to make some metal. You could take your time and cut all of these off. Again, I was explaining earlier, time versus value. This is all going to go as brass. So for me to take the time with all of these on today's project, it's not going to be worth it. I'm only going to be left with a few hunks. It's going to make a little bit of difference in the weight value, but most of your weight is in this brass, and that's why it's downgraded, because it's all mixed metals in here. Your best scrapping price is when you have a metal all on its own. I could take all of these fittings off. That would even increase my copper return. I'm not at that point where I want to take the time, but that's also another way that you can make additional money and return on your scrapping, is if you remove any of those fittings and get the rest of that copper out. That starts to increase, and you'll be amazed at how quickly the weight adds up. I finished breaking down my pile of copper before I took it to the scrapyard. I decided to increase my return on this particular load. I ended up with 5 different buckets. Here's some steel that's not going to help us at all other than keep it in our steel pile. This was all straight brass, so I took all of the steel off of it. There's no copper left on it. Here is our brass. I'm guessing they're going to put it in as brass breakage, and what that means is there's just tons of stuff on it. So anything that had brass on it, and if it had my copper fittings or other fittings on here other than steel, I took all the steel off. So anything else that's on here is fittings that are soldered fittings, and there's still some copper. I could fine tune that and get the rest of that copper off. Today's event is not happening that way, so I'm just going to see how they take this particular grade with just the brass with all of this extra junk on it. And then here is all of my copper pipe. So there's no brass on any of these. These are all the copper ends that had soldered joints on them. That will change the grade from our straight copper. Now it depends on the yard that you go to or where you take your copper or your metals for recycling. I don't know if they're going to give me #1 grade on this, but what I did is I made sure that there were no fittings on here, no visible solder. It's all just straight copper. Even though it is used pipe, and they may consider it a lower grade, but we'll see what this particular yard does. If they do give me a little bit better grade, it might only be 10-15 cents more a pound. Again, it depends on the market and your yard. So from this grade, which has all copper and copper fittings that have solder on them, to this grade is just a little bit of extra work to change that grade. If your yard doesn't care if they're all together and give you the same dollar amount for it per pound, don't use up your energy on it. With this particular scrap run, I had a lot of brass fittings in here, so that changed my whole plan on this load. If it was an entire load of copper with just copper and copper fittings, I would have put it all in as copper and take the little bit of a downgrade. But because this was all in there, and that's where the majority of your weight is, that's where they were going to weigh it in at and pay me for the entire load at that rate. So let's see what happens. We have all 5 grades. The steel is just going to go in my steel pile with all my mixed screws and junk. That's, you know, the lowest grade, 6-7 cents a pound depending on your yard. Could go all the way up to 9 cents a pound depending on the market.